The hammer came down on the auction block at 7:15 in the morning, and the sound of it carried 3 blocks to where John Wayne was standing outside the Morrow County Feed and Grain, drinking coffee from a tin cup he'd borrowed from no one in particular. He did not look up right away. He was watching a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the grain elevator, the bird tilting and adjusting with a patience that most men would call effortless, but that John Wayne recognized as something else entirely. Patience was not effortless. Patience was a thing you had to decide on, over and over, until it became habit. The hawk had decided. The bird banked east and disappeared behind the elevator's rusted crown, and the second hammer blow carried through the October air of Heppner, Oregon, with the particular flat authority of government business being conducted in a public square. John Wayne set the tin cup on the feed store's porch railing and looked toward the courthouse. The autumn of 1939 had come to Morrow County, the way bad years always arrived in the high desert country of eastern Oregon, quietly at first, then all at once. The wheat had come in thin for the 3rd consecutive year. The dryland farms that terraced the slopes above the John Day River had been fighting clay soil and erratic rainfall since the mid-30s, and by September of 1939, the county extension office in Heppner had tallied 61 farms operating at a loss. The price of soft white wheat, which was the crop this country grew and the crop this country depended upon, had settled at 41 cents a bushel, down from 52 cents the previous spring, and that 11-cent drop was the difference between a family eating through winter and a family losing what it had spent a generation building. Heppner itself was a town of 1,100 people. It occupied a narrow valley at the confluence of Willow Creek and the John Day River's North Fork, surrounded on 3 sides by wheat ground and juniper brakes, and the kind of distance that made a man feel both free and trapped depending on the week. The town had a courthouse, 3 churches, 2 saloons operating under the name of taverns, a hardware store, a dry goods, a barber shop, a diner called the Rimrock that opened at 5 in the morning and closed at 8 at night, and a branch office of the Cascade Mutual Agricultural Bank that occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Main Street with a granite facade that had been hauled in from Portland in 1921 and that looked, on most days, more permanent than anything around it. The bank was run by a man named Gerald Ashworth. Gerald Ashworth had been the branch manager since 1931, which meant he had managed the bank through the worst of the Depression and into the grinding agricultural contraction that followed it, and he had done so without losing money for his institution. This was not nothing. A great many branch managers in eastern Oregon had not managed it, and their branches had closed, and their depositors had lost savings, and the wreckage of those closures was still visible in the empty storefronts of towns like Condon and Fossil and Arlington. Gerald Ashworth had kept Cascade Mutual's Heppner office open and solvent, and he had done it partly through careful lending and partly through a willingness to foreclose that his predecessors had lacked. The farm that the hammer was coming down on at 7:15 that Thursday morning in October of 1939 belonged to a woman named Clara Delaney Foss. She was standing at the back of the small crowd on the courthouse steps when John Wayne heard that second hammer blow, and though he could not see her clearly from 3 blocks away, he could see the stillness of her. A person in that kind of pain does not fidget. Clara Foss had been born Clara Delaney in Pendleton, Oregon, in 1901, the 4th of 6 children of a man named Patrick Delaney, who had come west from County Kerry by way of Boston and St. Paul, and had arrived in Umatilla County with a teamster's body, a carpenter's hands, and a deep and permanent suspicion of banks that he had passed, incompletely, to all of his children. Patrick Delaney had worked the wheat harvests as a custom cutter for 12 years before he had enough saved to lease 40 acres south of Pendleton, and he had worked those 40 acres until Clara was 9 years old, when a June hailstorm had taken the entire crop in 20 minutes, and the landlord had declined to reduce the lease payment and Patrick Delaney had been forced to sell his 2 mules and move the family into town, where he went back to work as a teamster for the railroad's freight operation out of the Pendleton yards. Clara had grown up in a railroad household that smelled of axle grease and boiled coffee, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had tried to own something and failed. She had done well in the Pendleton schools, finishing the 11th grade before the family needed her wages, and she had worked for 3 years as a counter girl at the Pendleton Woolen Mills store before she met a man named Thomas Foss at a church social in the autumn of 1921. Thomas Foss was 26 years old, the son of a dry goods merchant from the small town of Lone, 12 miles northwest of Heppner. He was not large or imposing, but he was deliberate and kind, and he had a way of listening to a person that made them feel the world had gone quiet, specifically for them. Clara Delaney married Thomas Foss in the spring of 1922 and moved to a piece of ground that his father had deeded them as a wedding gift. 320 acres of dry land wheat, ground in the benchland above Willow Creek, 8 miles northwest of Heppner, with a 2-room house that Thomas spent the first summer expanding to 4 rooms, while Clara planted a kitchen garden that would still be producing tomatoes and pole beans 17 years later. They had built the Foss place the way everyone in that country built things, slowly, through seasons, with what was left over after the necessities were paid. Thomas borrowed $5,000 from Cascade Mutual in 1924 to buy a used case thresher and 2 additional quarters of adjacent ground that had come available when an older couple, named the Selbys, had moved to Portland to be near their daughter. He made his payments faithfully through 1929 and 1930 and into 1931. In 1932, when the wheat price fell through the floor and the drought took half the crop, he went to the bank and restructured the loan at Gerald Ashworth's suggestion, extending the term and reducing the monthly obligation in exchange for an interest rate adjustment that seemed, at the time, like a reasonable compromise. Thomas had signed the restructured note in November of 1932, with the particular careful signature of a man who understood that he was signing away some portion of his future options, and he had walked out of the Cascade Mutual office and driven home and told Clara what he'd done, and she had said that they would manage, and she had meant it. They had managed. Through 1933, 1934, 1935, thin years, grinding years, years when the payment on the restructured note took everything that wasn't food or seed, Thomas and Clara Foss had managed. They had 2 children by then, a boy named Patrick, born in 1923 and named for Clara's father, and a girl named Ruth, born in 1927. Patrick had taken to the farm with his father's deliberateness and was working alongside Thomas full-time by the time he was 14. Ruth was quieter and spent her evenings reading agricultural pamphlets from the extension office, with a focus that Clara found both admirable and slightly alarming in a 12-year-old girl. Thomas Foss died in the spring of 1937. It was not dramatic. He developed a cough in February that the doctor in Heppner called pneumonia, and he fought it for 6 weeks before it took him on a Tuesday night in late March, with Clara holding his left hand and Patrick holding his right, and Ruth asleep in the next room, because she was 9 years old and needed her sleep, and there was nothing she could do, and Clara had made the decision not to wake her. Thomas Foss died at 42 years old, having made every payment he had ever owed to anyone, having never cheated a neighbor, having served 2 terms on the Morrow County Soil Conservation Committee, and having produced, over 15 seasons, wheat that his neighbors considered among the cleanest and best graded in the county. Clara buried him on the rise behind the house under a juniper tree that Thomas himself had planted as a windbreak in 1928, and then she went inside and looked at the Cascade Mutual payment book and figured out what came next. What came next was 2 more years of managing, but at a higher cost, because Thomas had been one laborer that Clara no longer had. Patrick was 16 in 1937, and capable, but 16 is not 40, and the farm ran on a thinner margin than it had when Thomas was alive. She hired a part-time hand named Cordell Watts, who lived in Heppner and had worked harvests for most of his adult life. A gray-faced man of 50 who was reliable but not gifted. And between Clara, Patrick, and Cordell, the Foss place produced wheat in 1937 and 1938 that covered the note payment and the seed and the fuel for the thresher, and left almost nothing for anything else. The summer of 1939 broke them. Not all at once, and not through any single failure. The wheat yield came in at 11 bushels per acre, on ground that should have produced 22. A spider gear in the case thresher stripped in August at the worst possible moment, and the repair cost $47, which was $47 that did not exist. The price settled at 41 cents a bushel, and Clara did the arithmetic 3 times because she did not believe the first 2 answers, and all 3 times she arrived at the same number. She was short on the October payment by $231. $231 in October of 1939 was not a small sum. It was approximately what a working man in Morrow County earned in 6 weeks. It was more than Clara had cleared from the farm in the previous 3 months combined. She went to the bank in September. She sat across the desk from Gerald Ashworth in the Cascade Mutual office, with its granite facade and its smell of processed paper, and told him plainly that she would be short in October, and asked whether they could defer the payment or restructure again. Gerald Ashworth was not an unkind man. He had a wife and 3 children of his own, and he had grown up in Fossil, 40 miles south, and he understood what wheat ground meant to the families who worked it. He also had a set of guidelines from the Cascade Mutual Home Office in Portland that had been tightened twice in the past 2 years, and those guidelines did not accommodate a second restructuring on a note that had already been restructured once, not without a cosigner, and Clara Foss did not have anyone to cosign. Ashworth told her he would see what he could do. He wrote a letter to Portland. Portland wrote back in 11 days with a response that Ashworth considered carefully before delivering to Clara in a second meeting on the last day of September. The response was that the bank could offer a 60-day extension of the October payment, but that the extension would come with a fee of $35 and the requirement that the full arrearage, the October payment plus the extension fee plus the accumulated interest, be paid in full by December 1st, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Clara Foss went to her brother-in-law in Ione, a man named Harold Foss who ran the dry goods store that Thomas's father had founded and that Harold had taken over after the old man's death in 1935. Harold was not wealthy. He had a mortgage of his own on the store, and he had 2 children heading toward high school. He lent her $75, which was what he had, and told her he was sorry he couldn't do more, and meant it. Clara took the $75 and drove to the county seat and went to see the representative of the Farm Security Administration who held office hours in Heppner twice monthly. The FSA representative was a young man named Douglas Pratt, who had come from the Portland office with genuine intentions and a set of loan programs that were technically available to dryland wheat farmers in distress, but that in practice required documentation, yield records going back 5 years, tax filings, soil classification certificates. That took time to compile and process. Douglas Pratt told Clara that if she could have the complete application on his desk by October 15th, he could likely get a determination by November 22nd. November 22nd was 9 days before her December 1st deadline. Clara asked what would happen if the determination came back approved, but the bank moved on foreclosure before the FSA funds could be transferred. Douglas Pratt said he didn't know. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. She went to the Catholic church on the far end of Main Street and spoke to Father Callahan, who was a good man and who told her he would take up a special collection on her behalf, and who did, and raised $48.20 from a congregation that did not have a great deal more to give. Clara thanked him and thanked the congregation and drove home with $123 in her coat pocket, which was $108 short of what she needed, and with 11 days left to find it. She went to the Savings Association in Condon, 40 miles south, and they told her they weren't making new loans to dryland operations in the current climate. She drove to the First Agricultural Bank in Pendleton and waited 2 hours to see a lending officer who reviewed the Foss Place's financials for 20 minutes and told her he wished he could help. She went back to Douglas Pratt and asked whether there was any mechanism for expediting the FSA determination, and he told her he'd flagged the application as urgent, and that was the best he could do. On the morning of October 19th, Gerald Ashworth filed the foreclosure notice with the Morrow County Courthouse. He had waited until he was required to file it, not a day earlier. That was the kind of man he was. But he filed it, because that was also the kind of man he was. The public auction was set for October 26th at 7 in the morning. John Wayne had arrived in Heppner, Oregon on the afternoon of October 22nd, coming down from the north on Highway 74. In a 2-ton Ford truck, he was running a load of bred heifers south to a ranch in Dayville. He was not from this part of Oregon. He was from further south, down toward Prineville country, where he had spent the previous 2 years running cattle on leased ground, while he decided what to do with himself after a long stretch of work that had taken him through Wyoming and northern Nevada and one hard winter in the Idaho Panhandle. He was 42 years old that autumn, broad-shouldered and unhurried in his movements, with a face that the sun and wind and a certain amount of deliberate living had weathered into something that took up space in a room without effort. He wore a high-crowned Stetson the color of old saddle leather and a cavalry shirt under a dusty leather vest, and he drove the way he did everything else, without apparent rush, with complete attention. He had stopped in Heppner because one of the heifers had developed a loose board in the trailer floor, and he wasn't going to push the animals another 80 miles on an uncertain floor, and the Heppner garage on the south end of Main Street had the tools and the man to fix it. While the garage man, a younger fellow named Arlen Good, replaced the board and reinforced the trailer deck with a second plank, John Wayne walked up Main Street and stopped at the Rimrock Diner and ate a plate of eggs and toast and drank 3 cups of coffee and listened to what the other men in the diner were talking about. What they were talking about on that Wednesday afternoon was the Foss auction. He did not ask questions that first afternoon. He sat at the counter and ate and listened, and what he heard was enough to understand the shape of the thing without knowing all its particulars. A widow woman, a wheat farm, 3 years of bad price and 1 bad yield too many, a bank that had done what banks do, an auction in 4 days. He heard the name Clara Foss spoken 6 times in 20 minutes of diner conversation, and the way the men said it, not with pity exactly, but with a kind of restrained grievance, the way men talk about something that they consider wrong but cannot fix, told him a great deal about what kind of woman she was in this community. He paid for his meal and walked back to the garage and found the trailer repaired, and Arlen Good wiping his hands on a shop rag and looking pleased with the work. John Wayne looked at the repair himself before he said anything about it, crouching down on his heels and running his hand along the new board, testing the bolt heads and the cross bracing. He paid Arlen $8 for the work, which was more than Arlen had asked, and then he asked whether there was a decent place to overnight the trailer and the animals. Arlen Good said that Dale Murchison's place had a holding pen out back, that Dale rented by the day to through haulers, $3 a night, hay included, and that Dale was the kind of man you could talk to. John Wayne said he appreciated that and drove the trailer around to Dale Murchison's place, which was a modest operation on the east side of town, with a weathered house and a set of corrals that were old but sound. Dale Murchison came out to meet him, and they talked briefly about the heifers and the road conditions south, and the state of the dryland wheat operation in general, and John Wayne rented the pen for 2 nights, without explaining why he might need 2 nights when Dayville was only 1 day's drive south. That evening he went back to the Rimrock and ate again, and this time he sat at a table near 2 men who were talking about the auction, and this time he asked one question. He asked the older of the 2 men, a rancher type with a county commissioner's confidence about him, what the amount was. The man said the amount was $231 on the note payment. He said the full note balance was $3,410, and that the auction would clear all of it and leave Clara Foss with whatever the farm brought above that figure, which in this market and this season was likely to be very little. John Wayne nodded and said he appreciated the information and went back to eating his supper. He did not sleep at the hotel that night. He sat in the cab of the Ford truck in the parking area beside Dale Murchison's corrals and looked at the dark shapes of the heifers and thought about a farm in Pendleton country where he had worked one summer harvest as a young man, the summer he was 20, and learning what the land could take from a person and what it could give back. He thought about the sound of a hammer on an auction block. The next morning, Thursday, October 23rd, John Wayne walked to the Cascade Mutual Bank when it opened at 9 o'clock and spoke with Gerald Ashworth. The conversation was brief and direct and took place in Ashworth's office with the door closed. John Wayne sat in the chair across from the desk with his hat on his knee, and he asked what it would take, total, to satisfy the note on the Foss property and stop the foreclosure proceeding and clear the title. Ashworth told him the number, $3,410, which was the outstanding principal, plus the 60-day extension fee of $35 that Clara had agreed to and not been able to pay, plus accumulated interest through October 26th, which was the auction date. Ashworth said he would need to calculate the final interest figure, but that the total would come to approximately $3,472. John Wayne said he understood. He asked whether the payment had to come from Clara Foss, or whether a third party could settle the note and be assigned the mortgage, which would effectively clear the foreclosure and return the title to Clara Foss, free of the encumbrance. Ashworth said that was not the standard arrangement. He said the bank's preference was to receive the payment from the property owner. John Wayne said he understood the bank's preference and asked again whether it was possible. Ashworth looked at him for a long moment and then said that it was technically possible. He said a third party could purchase the note at face value, which would satisfy the foreclosure proceeding, and that note could then be assigned back to the property owner at whatever terms the purchasing party chose to set, including no terms at all. John Wayne nodded. He said he would need until the morning of the auction to make the arrangements, and asked whether Ashworth could hold the proceeding until 8 o'clock rather than 7:15. Ashworth said he had already filed the auction notice and the time was set by the court, and he was not in a position to delay a court-filed proceeding. John Wayne said he understood, and stood and put on his hat and thanked Ashworth for his time, and left. He went to the Heppner branch of the Oregon State Bank, which was in a storefront 2 doors east of the Rimrock, and he sent a wire to the Crook County Bank in Prineville, where he maintained an account, asking them to wire $3,500 to the Oregon State Bank in Heppner, in his name, by the opening of business on October 26th. The wire cost him 60 cents. He stood at the counter and watched the operator send it, and then he walked outside and stood on the sidewalk in the October morning and looked up at the sky, which was clear and cold, and the particular shade of blue that comes to the high desert in late autumn, and he stood there for 2 minutes, doing nothing in particular, before he walked back toward the corrals to check on the heifers. He did not go to the courthouse auction on the morning of October 24th or 25th to watch the other properties being processed through. He spent those 2 days working on the truck, which had developed a rattle in the right front wheel that he tracked down to a loose bearing retainer, and eating at the Rimrock, and walking the length of Main Street twice a day without apparent purpose. He did not speak to Clara Foss. He did not know her. He did not seek her out. He saw her once, on the afternoon of the 24th, coming out of the hardware store with a paper bag under her arm, and her son Patrick beside her, a tall young man of 16 with his father's careful way of moving. Clara Foss was 38 years old, and looked neither beaten nor broken, which told John Wayne something he filed away without analysis. He wired the Crook County Bank on the morning of the 25th to confirm the transfer, and received confirmation that $3,500 had cleared to the Oregon State Bank in Heppner as of 9 that morning. He went to the Oregon State Bank and withdrew $3,500 in cash, 20s and 10s and 50s, which he counted at the teller's window and then folded and placed in a canvas envelope that he put inside his vest. He thanked the teller, a young woman named Estelle Barker who counted the bills with professional speed, and walked out. The morning of October 26th was cold. A high-pressure system had moved in from the north during the night, and the temperature at 7 o'clock was 28 degrees, and the breath of the small crowd on the courthouse steps hung in the air like a secondary kind of weather. The auctioneer was a county employee named Vernon Chalk, a stout man in his 50s with a county clerk's methodical manner, who held a clipboard and wore a wool coat, and looked like a man who would rather be doing something else. Gerald Ashworth was there, standing to one side of the steps in a good overcoat, his hands in his pockets. There were perhaps 30 people on the courthouse steps and along the sidewalk, some of them there because they had a financial interest in what happened to the Foss place, and some of them there because in a small town of 1,100 people, a foreclosure auction was a public event, and people came to public events. Clara Foss was there. She stood at the back of the group with Patrick beside her and her daughter Ruth, who was 12 and should not have been there but had come anyway, and whose presence Clara had decided not to argue about on this particular morning. Clara was wearing a dark wool coat and holding her hands together in front of her, and she was not crying, and she was not looking at the ground. She was watching Vernon Chalk set up his clipboard on the portable podium with the attention of a person who intends to see every moment of what is about to happen to her. John Wayne came from the direction of the OSB building, walking north on Main Street, and arrived at the courthouse steps at 7:12. He moved through the crowd without ceremony, not pushing but not asking permission either, the way a large man moves when he knows where he is going. He stopped at the base of the steps, 3 feet from where Vernon Chalk was sorting through his papers, and he took off his hat and held it in his left hand and stood. Vernon Chalk looked up. He looked at John Wayne the way most people looked at John Wayne when he appeared in their immediate vicinity, with a brief recalibration of their sense of the space available. John Wayne said, "I need a minute before you start." Vernon Chalk said that the auction had been noticed for 7:15, and it was nearly 7:15. John Wayne said he understood that, and reached inside his vest and produced the canvas envelope and opened it on the top of Chalk's clipboard, so that the folded bills were visible to anyone standing near, which was everyone on the steps. He said he wanted to settle the Foss note in full before the auction proceeded, and that he had the funds, and that he would need the appropriate documentation drawn up showing the note satisfied and the mortgage cleared. The crowd had gone quiet, not gradually but all at once, the way crowds go quiet when something unexpected and decisive happens in their presence. Gerald Ashworth stepped forward from where he had been standing to the side. He looked at the envelope and at John Wayne and said that the foreclosure proceeding was a matter of public record and a court document, and that it was not his decision alone to halt it. John Wayne said he understood, and asked Ashworth what the exact amount was, to the dollar. Ashworth said he had the final calculation with him. He opened his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper that he had prepared the previous day and handed it to John Wayne. The final total, principal, extension fee, accumulated interest through October 26th, was $3,478. John Wayne looked at the paper once and handed it back to Ashworth. He counted 28 $100 bills and 2 10s and 8 1s from the envelope placing them in a single stack on Chalk's clipboard. He placed them deliberately, each bill laid flat, the stack orderly and exact. He said the amount was $3,478, and he would need a receipt. Nobody in that crowd moved. Ashworth looked at the bills and at John Wayne. He looked at Vernon Chalk. Chalk looked back at him with the expression of a man waiting to be told what his job required him to do next. Ashworth said that technically the proceeding could be withdrawn if the note was satisfied prior to the auction call. He said he would need the court to formally withdraw the notice, and that would require a signature from the county recorder. John Wayne said they should get the county recorder then. There was a pause of perhaps 15 seconds. Then Ashworth picked up the stack of bills and counted them himself. He counted them twice, laying them out in columns on the clipboard, with the methodical efficiency of a man who had counted money his entire professional life. The amount was $3,478 exactly. He said he would go inside and speak to the recorder. He went inside. The crowd on the steps remained where it was, because no one had signaled that anything was finished or concluded or safe to walk away from. Patrick Foss had stepped forward from the back of the group and was standing at the edge of the open space around John Wayne and Vernon Chalk, and the expression on his 16-year-old face was one that John Wayne recognized without looking directly at it. The expression of a young man encountering something he does not have the vocabulary for yet. John Wayne looked at Vernon Chalk and asked for a pen. Chalk provided one. John Wayne signed his name at the bottom of the interest calculation sheet that Ashworth had left on the clipboard, signing as the purchasing party of record. And then he asked Chalk to date it and initial it as a witness, which Chalk did with the air of a man following a procedure he had not been trained for but was managing adequately. Clara Foss came forward through the crowd. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at his face, and then at the clipboard, and then back at his face. She said, "You're not from here." He said he wasn't. She said she didn't understand what was happening. He said the bank would come out in a few minutes with some paperwork, and that the note on her property would be satisfied as of this morning. He said the title would come back clear, with no encumbrance. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, her daughter Ruth had come forward and taken Clara's hand, without either of them acknowledging it. Clara said, "What do you want for it?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "That's not how it works." He said, "It is today." Gerald Ashworth came back through the courthouse doors at 7:31 with the county recorder, a small, neat woman named Harriet Vance, who carried a leather-bound ledger and wore the expression of someone called away from something important. Harriet Vance reviewed the situation with the precision of a person who had spent 20 years ensuring that the county's official record was not a source of future litigation. She asked John Wayne for his full name and county of residence, which he provided. She confirmed the amount with Ashworth. She entered the satisfaction of the note in the county record in her own hand and had both John Wayne and Gerald Ashworth sign the ledger, and then she prepared a handwritten receipt on county letterhead that stated, in formal language, that the mortgage note of record against the Foss property, parcel number 14-7-22, in the amount of $3,478, had been satisfied in full on October 26, 1939, and that the property was hereby clear of said encumbrance. She gave the original to Clara Foss. She said, "That's yours, Mrs. Foss. The farm is clear." Clara held the paper in both hands and looked at it. She did not cry. She had been told by her mother, years earlier, that crying at the moment you were saved was a kind of vanity, a way of making the rescue about your feelings rather than your gratitude, and Clara Foss had inherited enough of her mother's discipline to keep her face still even when her hands were shaking. The paper shook. She held it steady. Ruth Foss, who was 12 years old and had been reading agricultural pamphlets from the extension office, looked at the man in the dusty leather vest and the high-crowned Stetson and said, Why did you do it? He put his hat back on. He said, "Seemed right." That was the last sentence he said on the courthouse steps. He paid the full amount. He had paid more than was asked. The $3,478 was $22 more than the figure he had been given in his first conversation with Ashworth. The additional interest accumulated in the days since Ashworth had first calculated the balance, and he had paid it without comment. John Wayne thanked Vernon Chalk for his time and walked down the courthouse steps and turned south on Main Street toward Dale Murchison's corrals. He did not look back. The crowd on the steps remained in place for another several minutes, watching him go, and two of the men who had been there moved to follow at a distance and then thought better of it. Patrick Foss started forward, and his mother put her hand on his arm without looking at him, and he stayed. One man did follow, at a distance. His name was Raymond Aldrich, and he was a neighbor of the Fosses who farmed wheat ground 3 miles west of the Foss place, and who had known Thomas Foss for the last 8 years of Thomas's life. Raymond Aldrich was 54 years old and not given to emotional gestures, but he had watched what happened on those courthouse steps with a feeling in his chest that he could not have named precisely, and he walked south on Main Street until he came alongside John Wayne at the corner of Main and 2nd. He said, "I'd like to shake your hand." John Wayne stopped and shook his hand. Raymond Aldrich said he'd been farming in Morrow County for 19 years, and he'd never seen anything like what had just happened. John Wayne said he appreciated that and thanked him. Raymond said, "Can I ask you your business here? What brought you through Heppner?" John Wayne said he was hauling bred heifers down to Dayville for a ranch in that country, and that he'd had a trailer repair that delayed him a few days. Raymond said, "That's all?" John Wayne said, "That's all." He left Dale Murchison's corrals at 8:40 that morning, backing the Ford truck out of the pen, with the heifers loaded, and the trailer floor solid, and the right front bearing tight. Dale Murchison came out to watch him go and raised a hand as John Wayne pulled onto the road south. John Wayne raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in return without turning his head, and the truck moved south on Highway 74 in the October morning, raising a thin line of dust that the north wind took east and dispersed over the wheat stubble. He did not stop at the rimrock. He did not stop at the bank. He had said everything that required saying and done everything that required doing, and Dayville was 80 miles south, and the ranch there was expecting those heifers. Clara Foss and her son Patrick drove back to the farm that morning, in the same pickup truck they'd been driving for 6 years, a 1933 Dodge half-ton that Thomas had bought used, and that Patrick now kept running, with the kind of mechanical patience his father had modeled for him. They did not talk much on the drive. The paper was on Clara's lap, folded once, and she kept her hand flat on it the way you keep a hand on something you are not quite ready to look at again, but need to know is there. Ruth sat between them and looked out the windshield and didn't say anything either. When they got to the farm, Clara went inside and put the receipt in the wooden box on the kitchen shelf where she kept the important documents: the deed, the soil classification certificate, the extension service records, Patrick's birth certificate, Ruth's birth certificate, Thomas's death certificate. The receipt was the thinnest paper of all of them, county letterhead in Harriet Vance's small, precise hand, but she placed it on top of the others and closed the box and put the box back on the shelf. Then she went outside and stood in the kitchen garden for a few minutes, looking at the juniper on the rise where Thomas was buried. The tomatoes were long done. The pole beans had dried on their stalks. The garden smelled of frozen soil and the particular clean cold of an October morning after the temperature had been below freezing for 3 nights running. She went back inside and made coffee and drank it at the kitchen table, and then got up and started making a list of what needed to happen before spring. In the Rimrock Diner that morning, between 9 and noon, the conversation was entirely about what had happened on the courthouse steps. The diner's owner, a man named Walt Pemberton, had been in the crowd and reported the details with the care of an eyewitness who knows he will be questioned repeatedly and wants to get the facts straight. What denomination were the bills? How many? Who had counted them? What the man had said and in what order? The name he'd given to the county recorder. Several people in the diner had not been present and had only the second-hand account, and they were skeptical in the way that small-town people are skeptical of stories that seem too clean. Walt Pemberton said they were welcome to go down to the county recorder's office and look at the ledger themselves if they didn't believe him, and 3 people did exactly that before noon. Harriet Vance confirmed everything, briefly and without embellishment, and sent them back out with the recorder's office door closed behind them. By afternoon, the information had reached the hardware store, the barber shop, both taverns, and the post office. The postmaster, a man named Chester Burke, who had worked in Heppner for 22 years, and considered it his professional duty to know everything that happened in the county, telephoned his counterpart in Dayville and asked whether a man matching the description had passed through with a load of heifers. The Dayville postmaster called back that evening and said yes, the man had unloaded at the Murdoch Ranch that afternoon and driven north again, and that Merle Murdoch said the man's name was John Wayne and that he was a known figure in the cattle country from Prineville down to Burns. Chester Burke said, "Is that so?" The Dayville postmaster said it was. Back at the Foss farm, the days that followed the auction were quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that had preceded it. Before October 26th, the quiet of the farm had been the quiet of a place waiting for a thing that cannot be stopped. After October 26th, it was simply the quiet of late autumn, which is the quiet of work suspended and preparation underway, and it felt entirely different. Patrick plowed the stubble under on the south field in late November, working the ground before it froze hard, and Clara filed the FSA application that Douglas Pratt had been working on. Not because she needed the loan now, but because Douglas Pratt had put real work into it, and she did not think it was right to leave it unfiled. Douglas Pratt called her when it came through, approved the following March, and she thanked him genuinely and told him she would keep it in mind if her situation changed. And he said he understood, and he did. Ruth Foss, who was 12 years old and had been at the courthouse steps and had asked the only direct question anyone had thought to ask, carried that morning with her the way certain mornings stay in a person. She had grown up in a household where problems arrived fully formed and required to be solved with what was available, and she understood that what had happened on the courthouse steps was not standard, not expected, not something she should consider the default behavior of the world. But she also understood, with the clarity that 12-year-olds occasionally achieve on important subjects, that it had happened, and that it had happened because one man had decided that it was going to, and that the deciding had been the entire thing. Raymond Aldrich rode over to the Foss place the week after the auction and offered Clara the use of his bull for the spring, which was a significant practical gift, and then stayed for coffee and told her what little he knew about the man who had paid the note. Clara listened and asked one question, which was whether Raymond knew if the man had family. Raymond said he didn't know. Clara nodded and did not ask again. She wrote a letter to the post office in Dayville, addressed to John Wayne, care of the Murdoch Ranch. She thanked him plainly and without flourish, the way she had been raised to thank people, specifically and honestly, without inflation. She said what the farm was to her and to her children. She said she intended to keep the note payment current from this point forward, without further difficulty, which was both a statement of intent and a kind of promise. She said she did not know how to repay what he had done, and that she understood she might not be able to, but that she wanted him to know it had not gone unnoticed and would not go unforgotten. The letter came back to Heppner 3 weeks later, with a Dayville postmark and a notation on the envelope that the addressee was no longer at that location and no forwarding address was available. Clara kept the letter. She put it in the wooden box on the kitchen shelf with the other papers. By the spring of 1940, The Foss place was operating with the focused efficiency of a farm that has been given a second chance and knows it. Clara had used the winter to recalculate every element of their operation: seed costs, fuel requirements, the price floor below which they could not absorb a shortfall, the exact yield per acre they needed to break even versus to build a reserve. She had written everything in a school composition book in columns, the way a person writes who learned accounting by necessity rather than instruction. She shared the book with Patrick, and they discussed it at the kitchen table on 3 consecutive February evenings, going through the numbers the way Thomas would have, slowly, without assumption, open to revision. They planted winter wheat on 280 acres that spring and left 40 acres fallow for rotation, which was the first time since Thomas's illness that they'd been able to afford to rest ground. Cordell Watts came back to help with the summer work. Ruth, who was 13 and had decided that she was going to know everything about wheat agriculture, spent 2 evenings a week at the county extension office learning to read soil moisture tables and talking to the extension agent, a patient man named Gerald Hofstetter who had been dealing with dryland farmers in Morrow County for a long time and who found Ruth Foss's questions to be among the most precise he'd encountered in a decade. The 1940 harvest came in at 19 bushels per acre. Not exceptional, but solid. The price had recovered slightly, to 44 cents. The note payment cleared in October, with $41 to spare, and Clara put the $41 in the wooden box on the kitchen shelf, which was not a savings account, but served some of the same purposes. She made every payment after that. Through 1941 and 1942, when the war changed the price of wheat and the demand for it in ways that finally, after a decade of contraction, began to favor the dryland farmers of eastern Oregon. Through 1943, when Patrick Foss was drafted and went to the Pacific, and Clara ran the farm with Cordell Watts and 2 seasonal hands, and her daughter Ruth, who was 16, and had become by that point the most technically proficient wheat grower on the Foss property. Through 1944 and 1945, when the note balance fell below $2,000, and then below $1,000, and then, in the fall of 1946, reached 0. She paid it off in full in September of 1946. She drove to the Cascade Mutual Bank in Heppner and sat across from Gerald Ashworth, who was still the branch manager and who had gone gray in the years since 1939. And she placed a check for $943 on his desk, the remaining principal, plus the final interest, exact to the penny, because she had done the arithmetic herself and confirmed it with Ashworth in writing a week before, and she waited while he processed it and prepared the release of mortgage. She signed the release. Harriet Vance was still the county recorder, and she entered the final satisfaction in the county ledger in her small, precise hand, just as she had done for the first satisfaction 7 years earlier. Clara Foss drove home with a clear title to 320 acres of dryland wheat ground and a kitchen garden that still produced tomatoes and pole beans, and she took the wooden box down from the kitchen shelf and put the title release inside it and stood for a moment with the box open, looking at all the papers in it. The original Harriet Vance receipt from October 26, 1939, was still on top. It had been on top since the morning she'd put it there, because she had not rearranged the papers, and because everything added afterward had been placed beneath it. She left it on top. She put the box back on the shelf. Patrick came home from the Pacific in 1946 with a Navy Cross and 2 missing fingers on his left hand from a mortar incident on Peleliu that he did not discuss, and he walked the Foss Place's south field the afternoon he arrived home and said it looked good. He meant it as a farmer's compliment, which is the least sentimental and most sincere kind. He came back into the operation fully by spring of 1947, and by 1950 was running the day-to-day work, while Clara focused on the bookkeeping and the market relationships she'd built with 3 grain elevators in the county over the previous decade. Ruth had gone to Oregon State College in Corvallis in 1945 on a scholarship and come back in 1949 with a degree in agricultural science and a husband named David Chen, who was also an agricultural scientist and who looked at the Foss Place's soil profile records with an expression of professional respect that Ruth found satisfying. David and Ruth built a house on the north quarter of the Foss acreage in 1951 and began applying the soil conservation practices Ruth had studied under Gerald Hofstetter and refined in college. And by 1955, the Foss Place was producing consistently at 23 to 25 bushels per acre, which was in the top quartile for dryland wheat in Morrow County, and which represented, in Ruth's careful accounting, a net annual income that Thomas Foss had never seen in the best year of his farming life. Raymond Aldrich, who had been their neighbor and who had shaken John Wayne's hand on the sidewalk that October morning, died in 1953 and left his farm to his son, a young man named Earl Aldrich, who had grown up hearing the story of the Foss auction from his father. Raymond had told the story not as a piece of local color but as a document of principle, as evidence that a man could look at an injustice that was not his own business and decide that it was, in fact, his business, and act accordingly. Earl Aldrich grew up with that story as a working part of his understanding of what men were supposed to do. And when Earl had a neighbor in difficulty in 1961, a young couple named the Hathaways who had bought dry ground north of Lone and were short on their first year's note, Earl Aldrich drove to the Hepner branch of Cascade Mutual and paid the shortfall, $212, and told the bank to send the Hathaways a receipt. He did not tell anyone he had done it. His wife found out 2 years later and asked him why he hadn't mentioned it. Earl said he hadn't thought it required mentioning. His wife looked at him for a moment and said that sounded like something his father would have said, and Earl said he supposed it did. By 1960, the Foss Place had grown to 480 acres through the purchase of an adjacent parcel that had come available when the Selby's descendants, who had inherited the ground that Thomas Foss had bought in 1924 and then lost in 1931 in a separate transaction, decided to sell. Patrick bought it for $17 an acre, which was a fair price for that ground in that year, and he paid cash because the Foss farm did not carry debt. It had not carried debt since September of 1946. The wooden box on the kitchen shelf had been moved twice by 1960, once when Clara had the kitchen repainted in 1952, and once when Ruth reorganized the kitchen cabinets in 1958. But it was still in the kitchen, still on the shelf, and the original Harry advance receipt from October 26, 1939, was still in it. Clara had shown it to Patrick's children, 3 of them by 1960, ranging from 8 to 14 years old. She had shown it to Ruth and David's 2 children. She had shown it to everyone who had been brought into the Foss family and who needed to understand where the farm had come from and what it had survived. By the summer of 1978, a long time had passed since the October morning on the courthouse steps in Hepner. Clara Foss was 77 years old and still living in the 4-room house that Thomas had expanded in their first summer, though it had been added to twice more since then. She moved more slowly and she had given the day-to-day bookkeeping to Ruth, but she still walked the south field most mornings and could read a wheat stand better than anyone on the property who was under 50. Patrick Foss died in 1975, at 52, of a heart attack, which his doctor said was not unrelated to the compressed, effortful years in the Pacific, and which the family said nothing about, because Patrick had said nothing about it, and they honored his privacy even in death. His wife, a woman named Loretta, continued to live in the house Patrick had built on the East Quarter, and their children, 3 of them, now grown, continued to work the farm's 480 acres alongside Ruth and David Chen and their 2 children, who were themselves approaching the age of working the ground. The Foss Place in 1978 ran 455 acres of dryland wheat and 25 acres of irrigated garden and pasture. It produced, in the 1978 season, an average yield of 27 bushels per acre on the wheat ground, at a price that had settled in the high $2 range per bushel, a price that Thomas Foss, who had sold wheat at 41 cents, would not have recognized as the same commodity. The farm's gross revenue in 1978 was approximately $26,000, and it operated at a net margin that the Morrow County Extension Service, which now held the Foss operation up as a model of dryland wheat sustainability, cited in its public literature, without identifying the farm by name, because the Foss family had not requested recognition, and the Extension Service respected that. Ruth Chen, who had been Ruth Foss and who was 51 years old in 1978 and had been the primary technical mind of the operation for 30 years, kept the County Extension Service's records and her own detailed yield histories in a filing cabinet in the office she and David had built off the back of the main house. In the top drawer of the filing cabinet, which she kept locked, was a photocopy of the original Harriet Vance receipt from October 26, 1939. The original was still in the wooden box on the kitchen shelf. Ruth kept the photocopy in the filing cabinet because she believed that the most important documents should exist in two places, and because she believed that the receipt was the most important document the farm possessed, more important than the deed itself, because the deed described what was owned, but the receipt described what had been preserved. In the summer of 1991, Ruth Chen's granddaughter, a girl named Lily Chen who was 9 years old and was visiting the Foss place with her parents, found the wooden box on the kitchen shelf and asked what was in it. Clara Foss, who was 90 years old and still living in the house and whose mind remained completely intact even if her body had come to terms with its limitations, took the box down and sat with Lily at the kitchen table and went through the papers one by one. She explained each document in terms that a 9-year-old could understand without simplifying anything essential. When she came to the Harriet Vance receipt, she held it up and told Lily what it meant, and told her the story of the morning on the courthouse steps. Lily asked whether the man had been a real person. Clara said he was a real person. Lily asked where he was now. Clara said she didn't know. She said she had never seen him again after he walked south on Main Street that morning. She said he had gone to Dayville with his cattle and driven north again, and no one in Heppner had heard from him since, and that she had written him a letter that had come back undeliverable, and that she had not been able to find where to send it. Lily asked whether that made Clara sad. Clara thought about that for a moment. She said it had made her sad for a while, when she was younger, because she had wanted to return the kindness in some form, and the inability to do so had felt incomplete. She said that over time she had come to understand that his point had not been the receiving of thanks, and that insisting on finding a way to thank him would have been, in a certain sense, a misunderstanding of what he had done. She said he had paid the note and walked away, and that walking away had been as much a part of the gift as the money. Lily thought about that and said, "But you still wanted to say thank you." Clara said she had. She said she still did. She put the receipt back in the box and put the box on the shelf, and she and Lily went out to the kitchen garden, which still produced tomatoes and pole beans in the summer of 1991, and Clara showed Lily how to tell when a tomato is ready and when it only looks ready, which is a different thing entirely. Clara Foss died in April of 1993 at the age of 91. She died in the bedroom of the house Thomas had expanded in the summer of 1922, with the kitchen garden visible from the window and the juniper on the rise visible above the garden. She left the wooden box to Ruth Chen in her will, along with a note that said only, "The receipt on top is the most important piece of paper in this box. Make sure whoever comes after us knows what it means." Ruth Chen, who was 66 years old when her mother died, put the wooden box in the locked top drawer of the filing cabinet alongside the photocopy she had kept for 15 years, and she prepared a 2-page typed document that explained the receipt and its context and the events of October 26, 1939, in the detail that she had carried in her memory for most of her adult life. She placed the document in the box with the other papers. The Foss place, which by the 1990s was operated as Chen Foss Farms, the name chosen in 1978, when Ruth and David had formally entered into co-ownership with Patrick's estate, continued to operate as a dryland wheat farm through the end of the century and into the next. By 2005, Lily Chen, who had sat at the kitchen table with her great-grandmother in 1991 and held the Harriet Vance receipt in her 9-year-old hands, had returned to the farm with an agricultural economics degree from Oregon State and a practical mind that the County Extension Service recognized immediately. She introduced 3 new winter wheat varieties in her first 5 years, added a precision soil moisture monitoring system in the south and west fields, and raised the average yield to 31 bushels per acre. She also had the original Harriet Vance receipt mounted in a frame. She consulted with a conservator in Portland about acid-free materials and UV protective glass, and the framed receipt now hung on the wall of the farmhouse kitchen, at eye level, next to the window that looked out over the kitchen garden. The frame held the receipt, and beside it, a small card in Lily's handwriting that read, October 26, 1939, Heppner, Oregon, the Foss Farm, $3,478. Below the dollar amount, in smaller writing, the card said only, he walked away without waiting to be thanked. The County Extension Service in Heppner, which updated its historical records in 2010 to include a section on dryland wheat sustainability models in Morrow County, cited the Chen Foss operation as the oldest continuously operated family dryland wheat farm in the county's modern history, tracing its uninterrupted operation from 1922 to the present, 78 years without a break in ownership, without a forced sale, without a foreclosure. The citation noted that the farm had weathered the Dust Bowl years, the low-price decade of the late 30s, the labor shortage of the war years, and every subsequent fluctuation in commodity markets, and had done so without ever carrying debt after September of 1946. The citation did not mention October 26, 1939. The Chen Foss family had not asked for that morning to appear in the county's official history, and the Extension Service did not know to include it. But Harriet Vance's County Recorder's Ledger, the original bound volume from 1939, was preserved in the Morrow County Archives, and it was open to researchers, and on the page for October 26, 1939, in Harriet Vance's small, precise hand, was the entry, Mortgage Note of Record, Foss Property, Parcel 14-7-22, satisfied in full, $3,478, purchasing party John Wayne, Crook County, Oregon. The entry took 4 lines in the ledger. The handwriting was clear and even, as it was on every page of every volume Harriet Vance had maintained during her 26 years as county recorder, because Harriet Vance believed that public records existed for the people they described, not for the bureaucracy that kept them, and she had written every entry as if the person named in it would one day come to the archive and read it. Lily Chen found the ledger entry in 2008 during a research project she had undertaken to document the farm's legal history. She sat in the Morrow County Archives in the courthouse basement, the same courthouse, the same building, where the auction had been set for October 26, 1939, and she looked at Harriet Vance's handwriting and traced the letters with her fingertip without touching the page, the way a person approaches something old and important. She had known the story all her life. She had held the receipt when she was 9. She had heard it from her great-grandmother, and from Ruth, and from the typed document Ruth had placed in the wooden box. But the ledger entry was something different. The ledger entry was not a family document. It was not a receipt given and kept. It was the county's own record, made in the moment, by a woman who had not known or cared about the human drama of the morning, and who had simply written down what had happened, because it was her job to write down what happened, and her standard was precision. Lily Chen sat with the ledger for a long time. Then she asked the archivist for a high-resolution photographic copy, which she paid $20 for, and which she took home and placed in the wooden box alongside the original receipt and Ruth's typed document. The box was now quite full. In the kitchen of the farmhouse, the framed Harriet Vance receipt hung next to the window, at eye level, where a person standing at the sink could look at it while their hands were doing something else. The kitchen garden outside the window still produced tomatoes and pole beans in the summers, the same beds that Clara had planted in 1922 and that had been maintained, continuously, through everything. The south field, where Patrick had plowed the stubble under in November of 1939, with the particular focused energy of a young man who has been given a reason to keep going, produced winter wheat in 2008 that Lily harvested at 33 bushels per acre, a farm record. She noted it in the yield history she kept in the filing cabinet, in the same careful column format that Clara had introduced in the composition book in the winter of 1939, and that Ruth had maintained and that Lily had continued, because the numbers told the story of the land and the people who had worked it, and the numbers did not editorialize or exaggerate, and they did not require you to be the right kind of person to read them. The receipt on the wall said $3,478, and it meant everything that number had purchased, not the land, because the land would have been sold and possibly purchased again by someone else, and the land itself does not know who works it. What the number had purchased was the continuity, the unbroken line from Clara and Thomas in 1922 to Lily in 2008, the 86 years of one family learning one piece of ground and handing that knowledge forward intact. John Wayne had paid $3,478 for that. He had walked south on Main Street in Heppner, Oregon, on the morning of October 26, 1939, and turned toward the corrals where his heifers were loaded, and driven south toward Dayville, and no one in Heppner ever saw him again, and the letter Clara wrote to thank him came back undeliverable, and he had known, when he walked away, that it was likely to come back undeliverable, and he had walked away anyway. That is the kind of thing that does not require an audience. Some men understand this early, and some learn it through long practice, and some never learn it at all. John Wayne had understood it early, in the way that certain truths arrive not as lessons but as facts, simply the way things are, and the way a man who intends to live decently must therefore conduct himself. The Harriet Vance receipt hangs in its frame in the kitchen of the Chen Foss farmhouse to this day, because the family that kept it understood that the most important things that happen to us are often done by people who did not intend to be remembered, and that the obligation of the people who were helped is to do the remembering on their behalf, not as gratitude, which implies a debt, but as witness, which implies only that something happened and that it mattered, and that the world is different because of it.